Okay, well,
Thanks.
good afternoon everybody and welcome to Dundee University Review of the Arts, and we're very privileged today to have Robert Allen Jamieson with us, fresh from the Dundee Literary Festival where he did a lovely reading this afternoon. And I think, as by way of introduction, Robert Allen Jamieson is from Western Shetland, from the crofting community of Sanus. He published 2 novels and a collection of poetry before becoming a mature student at Edinburgh University, where he now teaches creative writing. I'd like to just start with inviting Allan to read us some of poems from his collection, North Atlantic Drift, perhaps?
I can do that easily, yes, indeed. A sound of the far west of Shetland. And a very sort of particular historical period as well, because language doesn't stand still, and given that Shetland has, over the last 30 odd years or so, gone through quite a transformation thanks to North Sea Isle, it's probably also an historical record. Although I'd like to think that my immediate family would understand absolutely fine.
Sure.
So I thought I'd read this poem here, which has a non-Shetland title. It's called Atlantis, and it's the story, I suppose, a lot of these poems are stories, of being in primary school in Sanus and finding out about the myth of Atlantis and the effect of that on an imaginative child, let's say. Atlantis. Mrs. Thompson telt them with a sunken land that slippet in and under, wast and fram fae Afric's muckle hill, where Atlas stood himsel, hunksing up the glob like it was just a stub he's carrying for the banks. And fu Shetland's sinking slowly still, just the taps of antique mountains that recked fae Nevis north and east to Jotunheimen, new Atlantic deep and lost. I put a back o' a sheet left ower fae Pepperin Butt. He took his pen and drew the outline o' an island, a land like Ireland, green and bonny, and he christened it Atlantis, in honour of the giant, his ain lost land. And he named the hills and lochs, he named the tuns and brochs, and gied it order, a land wi' water for a border, like Shetland, sook it in and under, Atlantic deep and lost.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Allan, for that beautiful poem, which I think in many ways is kind of sums up in lots of elements of that particular book of poetry. And there's a naming of places, the identity of Shetland, and the mythology as well, I suppose.
Something of that.
And I wonder what you're thinking of there in terms of the mythology as well as the history of Norse and Vikings and what you grew up with in terms of that story in Shetland that has since informed your writing.
Well, I think that poem is probably interesting because it combines a local legend that wouldn't have featured in a school syllabus, that of the giant Atla who sat in the middle of the island somewhere around about Weasel, throwing stones at passing ships and the like. And then the myth of Atlantis, which comes via the Greco-Roman intellectual tradition into English and makes its way ultimately to the very edge of Europe, you know. And I think that one of the sort of noticeable things, I suppose, as an adult looking back on that education, was the fact that Shetland itself played such a small part, you know, in the syllabus, and you know, it's something that I think has changed and continues to change, but. I mean, it's often the case, isn't it, where you have a community that's sort of marginal to the mainstream culture, that they learn not about themselves, but about the Jameses, Mary Queen of Scots, the Wars of the Roses, or indeed classical myth.
Yes, that's a familiar story for many of us in Scotland and much more widely afield, I suppose. But I'm also interested then in particular in North Atlantic Drift, but also in The Happy Land, your novel, where you have the Shetland poems written in a dialect which is particular to your area of Shetland, but you also have the prose translations in English. And I'm wondering about whether you have a particular reader in mind or several readers in mind as you're writing, because your poems are accessible clearly to Shetlanders, although some who are not from Sanus might wonder about your orthography, but also you're very keen to ensure that your books are accessible also for non-Shetlanders, and I wonder if that's a conscious process for you, or exactly who is your reader when you're writing?
Well, I'd like to think that although these books may be quite specific and local and particular, that an intelligent reader from anywhere could pick them up and get something from them. I mean, that there will be subtleties in pronunciation or in semantic subtleties maybe that the reader from elsewhere may miss. But I'd like to think that although they're very deeply rooted within that place, that culture, that they spread from there to reach the world potentially.
Yes, but you're not a hard line poet in the sense that there are some poets who would maybe refuse to translate a poem in Scots into English, for example.
I think this is a decision, and I mean the one thing I would say about the translations here is that I haven't poeticized them. Yeah. The model that I had in mind was the old Penguin Poets series, where you might get the Baudelaire in French, the original, and then at the bottom you get these little prose translations in a tiny point size that you really had to work hard. And they weren't poetry; they were just there so that the reader could decode the meaning, the subtleties of the meaning. So they're not poems in my mind. The English translations, they're there so that it removes the need for the local to deliver a semantic payoff to a non-local reader.
Yes.
And that allows me then the freedom to really explore the sound of the local without worrying whether anyone's going to understand it. Really.
Yes. And it's clearly been important to you also to use the sounds of the area that you come from in Shetland, and to get back to that. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you've come to your own orthography, or where you found the way to transmit the sounds for the non-Shetland reader.
Well, I mean, the first thing I should say probably is that my beginnings are quite particular linguistically. That is to say, I grew up in a house where there were 4 generations. A house and a half, really, with 4 generations in it. The oldest of which was my great-grandmother, who was born in 1884, and therefore I had access really to quite an antiquated form of the dialect. She would look after me quite a lot when I was young, and everyone else was off work and doing whatever. And I had a curiosity. I mean, I'd always had an ear, a curious ear, as far as language went. So I picked up quite a lot of a very old form of Shetland, sort of, without even being aware. And then when you sort of stray beyond your family or beyond the village, you realise that actually that's quite strange. But it is absolutely the voice of that experience, and I would say that this book varies from some of the other things. Because of the subject matter, I really wanted to be able to get as close to that as possible. Sure. In the establishment of the orthography, I looked a lot at versions of the dialect that have been written, historically. There's a lot of variation within the islands, as I'm sure you know, from one island, one parish to another. And there was a time when dialect writing would just be done, according to how the individual felt. There wasn't a systematic approach to it, and for the local audience that was fine. I mean, if there was some sort of deviation or misdirection in the way it was written down, the fact that the reader knew what they meant, they could kind of read through that. Then in the 1940s. When the New Shetlander magazine is established, becomes a sort of hub for literature, for writing in the islands. And when the Graham's brothers take over, John and Lolly Graham take over, they attempt to standardise. They're getting material in from different parts of the islands, written in sometimes fairly idiosyncratic and inconsistent ways, and they take it upon themselves then to edit. But they're working from their own knowledge of the dialect, which is based upon the fact that they come from the centre. Really,
Yes, yes.
Shetland has its own centre
yes,
margin
dynamics there
conflict.
too. Yes. And for yourself now as a Shetlander who's not living in Shetland, I wonder how important your geographical dislocation from Shetland has been in your writing about Shetland, and whether you're almost the outsider for you in Edinburgh, in the centre of Scotland now, is as a Shetlander, and in writing probably in dialect as well. And I wonder if that's a kind of route into poetry for you in terms of that otherness, if it's important to you.
Yeah, I mean, I do live in exile, and I feel that, and I don't really understand how contemporary Shetland functions and operates. I mean, not in depth, I mean, as an outsider. So the fascination that it holds for me as a writer now is largely historical. My interest is in, obviously, my own period, but further back as well. The effect of exile on the individual, well, I mean, I think if you do come from a very particular place, and not everybody does, some folk shift around a lot, they don't necessarily have that very particular sense of belonging, then that's always with you wherever you go. It doesn't matter whether you're Joyce living in Trieste or it's always working upon you. It does give you a certain distance, a certain intellectual distance perhaps from the place. It allows you in a way, I think, to make it yours. It becomes a place of your imagination as opposed to a real place.
Sure. Yes.
So there's a creative freedom in that, which hopefully is a good thing.
And certainly with your novel, The Happy Land, you've certainly used very much your own knowledge of Shetland, your upbringing there, as well as drawn on a range of historical documents. You've got an imaginative narrative, but there's a real blurring between fact and fiction, truth and memory, and so on. For a really sort of thrilling story of Shetland from Norse, pre-Norse times right through to 21st century. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you came to actually embark on such an ambitious project. Was it there for many years before it kind of found its way through, or?
And I think it just grew kind of layer by layer. I would use the analogy of oil painting, where you apply a certain covering to the canvas, a sort of base, and leave it for a while, and then you go back and you add more, and you keep adding layers, but there's something of those early coverings that sort of protrude through and are influence in some way, even right up to the very last layering. So it took, I think, from very first sketchings would have been, I think, 1995. It was published in 2010, so that's sort of 15 years of not working on it consistently, but returning to it with a new idea, with a new approach. And it begins with a contemporary story, and the sort of father-son colonial, the returning child of this particular family line who had gone out to New Zealand, New Zetland in around about 1900. So I had quite a lot of that to begin with. I had maybe 70,000 words of that story. Actually, before that, I had about 40,000 words written by the father, who disappears, that now plays no part in the novel.
It didn't survive.
So that was sort of cut away, and then I reduced that 70,000 down to about 40 in the final draft. But then around that grew this, from the real event, the fact that this bloke turned up at my door when I was living in Perth with blistered feet and a pair of brogues under his arm, and asked me if I was the minister. And there was another layer that went on as a result of what was a real life intervention, if you like, into the world of the novel, and that introduced the religious aspect of it. So I had a lot of material. I mean, I had the real life story of the landed family, the real life story of the local folk who established the school, and then the sort of fictional story of the colonial family returning. And what I liked about it was the combination of that, with the way that the narrative works as a whole, is that as the reader sort of makes their way through the history of Shetland, via the old minister who's discovering that for himself, you've got the other narrative, which is the one of return, sort of playing with that. And then I think that the novel completes itself, the arc, if you like, although it's not a straightforward arc, completes itself with a 100-year-old woman who was there at the very beginning, when the family first left, and is also there at the end. And she has sort of key information that hopefully
opens the door for us all at some point.
I hope so.
Yes. And I mean, structurally, it's very interesting that you have parts where the storyline has been scored out because the writer has just changed their mind on what's being included.
The minister is self-censored.
Yeah, self-censors, absolutely.
But giving himself away.
Yes, he lets us see what's there. You have, as I say, the historical documents and so on. Again, I wonder, similarly with the poetry book, you have photography, notes and commentary, as well as the English prose translation and the poems. At what point does the structure inform what you're writing? Which is coming first in what you're doing, the creation, the structure? How does that happen?
I think, I mean, for me, it begins with a kind of a mood or an intention or a feeling, without anything very specific being there. And then I research, and I don't mean I just go to archives. I mean I kind of go places and think about it and dig around and talk to people and just generally explore the world of the work, whatever that is. In this case, I mean, I lived it anyway, so it wasn't so hard. But with the novel, I mean, I spent a long time of just sort of wandering around, lost, I suppose, inside a world that would one day, I would manage to
come together.
Yes, or it's kind of like putting up a tent or something. You need to go inside it in the dark, and it takes a little while before
it's not always successful.
It takes a while, that's right.
Yes.
And the structure begins to show itself. The more you gather the material, the more naturally it seems, at any rate, the different bits fit together. And then I think once you've got a sense of what the narrative strategy is, you much more consciously start to work towards that, to fulfill whatever that core idea is. But the discovering of the idea, for me at any rate, takes a while.
Yes, no, that's interesting. And it's almost a collaborative process where you're the collaborator with yourself in different sort of aspects as historian, researcher, poet, creator, photographer.
Which is great fun.
Yeah.
I mean, the fun for me is not knowing what I'm going to do.
You just let it find its way.
That's right.
There are times surely of uncertainty when you're not sure of what's going to happen.
There was a long gap when I just didn't quite know how to finish it, and it was only when I got the idea of the 100-year-old woman who had the memory, to link back to 1900-ish. That's when it fitted into place for me. And
did that then allow you to order the fragments that you had as well?
Absolutely,
that was the key for you.
Yes, I mean, it retrospectively organised from the end.
Yes.
I mean, obviously you have an idea of where it's going, but the sort of final adjustment you do, or I did in this case, once I'd got that, the 5 interviews that are sort of scattered through the book.
Yeah. And has the reception for the novel been different in Shetland from mainland Scotland and elsewhere? The way that it's read and understood in Shetland is perhaps different from the way it would be understood elsewhere?
I think that in Shetland, because the historical side of it is to some extent known. I mean, it's a skewed history, and that everything is true, but it's moved sideways a bit, and names are changed. Not everything. 90% of it is true. And I think that there's a certain readership in Shetland that wondered why I'd done that. Why change the names? The reason is a straightforward one. I just wanted the creative freedom to make up the things I needed to make up. And if I had used the real place names, then suddenly you've got, then it seems as if you're sort of breaking with the reality, with the truth of it, in order to make the story. But if you break from that at the outset by changing the names, then it's your world and you can do anything in it. You know. Also, I think it's important that in my mind at any rate, that for the conceit of New Zetland to work, which is completely invented, it almost needs to be set juxtaposed with a fictional Shetland rather than a real one. Then the whole thing has that integrity of it being invented. You know.
I saw some sort of reflection in your photos in North Atlantic Drift where the sea has always got a little shimmer on it, as if it were it's reflecting the reality, and yet it's a slightly refracted reflection, and it made me think of the novel and kind of prefiguring that kind of concept of a New Zetland where things have kind of happened that have happened before, with the Norse settling in Shetland and now people settling here, and the way that language develops and is colonised by the incomers, and
that's a very acute observation, because it was in my mind that you know, by sort of inverting, if you like, the story of Shetland and this colonising that goes on there, I was echoing what had really happened over here, you know, in this part of the world, the Scots colonisation of Shetland. Yeah.
And there's also something in telling the history of Shetland in this narrative fictionalised form, which actually also gives you a freedom to give us as readers more of an in to the history, because it brings it alive. And I think particularly in the sections, for example, on the Truck Commission, where you're using first-hand reports, presumably, and yet you're able to take a much more nuanced view of different perspectives on what people might have thought of a system which in many ways was barbaric and dreadful, and yet was also very difficult to move away from, because it also would have brought some pain and poverty to people.
Well, there was nowhere else to go other than to emigrate, you know. The laird was all-powerful, and the prospect of change that the Truck Commission brought was only that until things happened, you know, and until there was actual political change based upon that. So you could understand why a certain proportion of the population would be reluctant to come out strongly against the prevailing order, even though in their hearts they may have felt it. So I mean, I think it's a really interesting moment in history. Not just in Shetland, but you know, the same thing is happening to some extent all through Scotland and elsewhere too, Ireland and the like, where the peasantry who've kind of had a hard time of it for centuries are finally beginning to sense some sort of freedom. The fact that it sends them to the ends of the world.
To find it, and with its impact then on the peoples that they meet up with at the other side.
And the sort of loss of continuity, I think that's one of the things I was interested in the novel, was how over 2 or 3 generations of not being here in Shetland, you know, people lose contact, you know, the families are broken by that to the point where the contemporary character, protagonist, doesn't even know that he's in the house of his forefathers.
Yes, that's right. That's an irony, and that for some people there will be no historic documents. That there will be a reliance on memory and on letters and fragments and so on. So there's a sort of difference in what sort of historical record is left for people.
That's right. I mean, there is if you're prepared to seek, I think, and that's the thing really. It's having the motivation or the impetus to go and find out. And you know, people are busy, they're trying to survive, but it's not everyone that has the time or the inclination to sift through all of these documents and records. And some people live quite happily in the contemporary world and have no desire whatsoever to know where they came from or who their parents.
And where's it taken you now? What's your next project that you're thinking about, or feeling that's leading to the next novel?
Well, quite far on actually. It's a story in itself, you know, how I came to the new book, and it's very definitely related thematically to Happy Land. Where to begin? I flew up to Shetland to launch the Happy Land in 2010 at the Book Festival, September, and it was the same year as the Heimferðin, which is when all the exiles returned from wherever. And there was a book published that year in celebration of that, drawn together all the stories of who went where, and the interesting emigration stories. And I was on my way up in the plane there, and I got talking to a woman who was also on her way to read at the festival, and she was from British Columbia, from Vancouver, although her background was Kent. And odd thing, I'd just come out of radiotherapy for cancer, so had she. So we sort of, we struck up a sort of cancer buddy friendship through this. And I went out to visit my dad afterwards. I was leafing through this book of emigrants and came across the story of James Alexander Tate, which I knew because there had been a couple of little articles in the New Shetlander magazine. And he was a Shetlander that went out to British Columbia, and that was all fine and good. And part of my recovery from the treatment was I live under the flight paths to Edinburgh Airport. So I'd been sitting watching, as I was getting better, watching these planes go over, and I thought, before I go back to work, I'm going to make a journey somewhere. No idea where. It was just sort of part of getting better. And Miranda, my friend, partner, whatever, over in Vancouver, said, well, why don't you come to the book festival over here? I can get you a free pass, you can go everywhere. So I flew over, and we had a week at the book festival, and I'd been corresponding with this bloke who lives quite far north from Vancouver in the interior of British Columbia, a place called Little Fort. And I sort of half set up that I would go and see him, didn't really know why, it was just, instinct. So it turned out that Miranda and myself drove 8 hours north from Vancouver to Little Fort, and finally found this place in pitch black, absolute outside edge of civilization, bears and wolves at the end of the clearing. His own little turbine plant in the stream, really doing the self-sufficiency thing, not in a hippie way, but in a pioneer way. And Byron Anderson's third generation Scots, he'd never been to Scotland, but he had this little shrine of things Scottish. So we had a nice couple of days there, and on the way up we'd passed through this town called Merritt, which is the country and western capital of Canada. It's in the middle of desert. You wouldn't think of being desert there, but it's the end of the desert belt that passes up Mexico, tails off up there. And coming back, Byron sent us a different route down through the Fraser Canyon. And it was only when I came back to Scotland that I realised I'd passed through the two significant places in the life of this James Alexander Tate. So, chance, whatever.
He's emerging,
So I started to read up more about him. He's interesting because he went out in 1884 to join his uncle, this place called Spencer's Bridge, and that was absolutely the kind of frontier of white settlement at the time. His uncle had gone out in the time of the gold rush. It wasn't really a gold rush, it was quickly exhausted, but thousands of people came north up the canyon at that time. There was quite a lot of... There was a brief war between the Kuto Indians, who, these are the people that Tate ended up living amongst. When he got to his uncle's place, business wasn't going quite so well, and he kind of went native, as they used to say. He married a local woman of the Nuchlakapamuk people, learned to speak the language fluently, to the point where they said that if he was in the dark with other folk talking, you wouldn't know. And he made a bit of a living taking rich Americans out big game hunting, and kind of pieced together a living for a decade or so. And then in 1894, 10 years after he'd gone out, this young German Jewish PhD student who was interested in the relationship between the shape and size of people's skulls and their intelligence and racial basis, and this was a big theory at the time. He got off the train in Spencer's Bridge. The train was recent, CPR had just been pushed through the canyon, and he wasn't having much luck with his studies. He couldn't really persuade people to have their skulls measured. And somebody said, oh, you should go and see Jimmy Tate. I mean, he would be a good help for you. And the two of them struck up a really close friendship. And Tate was quite a literary man, and he'd been corresponding with folk, like Jesuit priests who had been studying the local people in there. And this stranger turned out to be a young Franz Boas, who in time became one of the fathers of social anthropology in North America, and had a chair at Columbia University. And he'd been for 10 years or so going around the Pacific Northwest trying to get his doctorate together, essentially. And this bloke who actually lived there and had gone deep into this one community was gold dust to him, really. And through him, Tate published a really scholarly study on the Thompson Indians, as they were known at that time. And Boas managed to, sort of send him money. He sent him an Edison wax cylinder recorder and a camera, a decent camera.
Wow.
So he built up, because his wife was native, he was able to get the women to sing and dance.
Yes.
Whereas the others, anthropologists, I mean, they might get the men doing a war dance. But so he was able to really build up an amazing archive of photos and recordings. He's one of the key ethnographers in Canada, well known now. His story, though, takes a strange turn in 1899 when Antco, his wife, dies quite suddenly, and he makes his only trip back. He's in Edinburgh, he's in Liverpool, and he goes up to Shetland. For a couple of years he's away, and during that time he starts talking with this guy he'd been at school with, J.J. Halden Burgess, who's the great Shetland, I don't need to explain, the great Shetland writer of the period, who was an out there socialist and would stand at the market cross preaching. So when Tate goes back to British Columbia, he goes back with the idea that what the Indians really need is kind of organisation from a socialist standpoint. And he becomes, over the next 20 years or so, their key scribe, so that when the chiefs of British Columbia gather to compose their claim of right that they're going to present to the Canadian Premier, they congregate at Spence's Bridge, a tiny little place in the middle of nowhere, so that Jimmy Tate can... And there's a photo of him in Ottawa in, I think, 1912, all the assembled chiefs wearing their Western hats, and they're quite smartly dressed. You wouldn't know he wasn't one of them.
It's incredible,
Amazing. Anyway, he marries again. He has 6 kids very quickly with a woman of French descent, and he's working for the Canadian government as an ethnographer. He's still doing the big game hunting thing. He's doing quite well. When at the outbreak of the First World War, he comes out against Canada's involvement because he's an international socialist and he feels that this is just wrong. So the government money stops all of a sudden. And his life then becomes very tragic. Within a very short time, I mean, it all begins to fall apart. He has pains in his back, and he's ultimately diagnosed with an early form of, with some form of bowel cancer, and he has an early form of radiotherapy, and dies, at 58. The Indian rights movement that he's put so much time into still hasn't got anywhere, still hasn't today. And he leaves behind this widow and 6 kids. So it's a sort of tragic ending. But anyway, I got very involved in all of this. And the Scottish Arts Council, as was, kindly gave me a grant so I could go over and properly explore. I spent most of the summer of 2011 kind of up the valley, up the canyon, talking to people. I got in touch with the chief of the local band in Spence's Bridge, and met up with him, one of the elders, and amazingly, the year before they had celebrated 100 years of the claim of right, and they had built this outdoor theatre, and there was a little plaque to Tate right there.
It's an amazing story.
So I've got this wonderful historical material that in a way, it's kind of written. It doesn't really need me to do it again. But what I didn't know was just how alive the Indian First Nations rights issue
still is now.
So I'm working with a contemporary story which is sort of based around my travels there. And at the core of it is that. So in many ways you can see...
It's a similar process. And it's a similar interest around language and identity and Exile
and the rights of the
and
oppressed.
the rights of the
you know.
oppressed once
Yeah,
again, yes.
absolutely.
But with such a wonderful palette of
Yeah.
stories yet again.
And I've had a wonderful time. I've been over there 5 times now, and you know, I've had to learn about the settlement of North America.
Yes,
Never mind, you know, British Columbia.
it's great for curiosity as well, isn't it? Just to learn
fantastic
something
time.
new and learn about
I had
it.
about 2 years of just reading, really.
Yeah.
I've now got about 50,000 words of very loose first draft, and the narrative strategy is beginning to kind of show itself. And that's where I'm going next. But just odd coincidences in the fatedness of it all. When I was over doing my research, Miranda, who I met on that plane, my cancer buddy, I said, oh, you know, it's really interesting because I found out that Tate actually had an early form of radiotherapy, and it was here in Vancouver. And she said, where was that? I said, it was St Paul's Hospital. She said, that's where I work.
Oh no, it's just uncanny, isn't it? There's something.
She took me upstairs to the, and there was a line of photos on the wall,
Yeah.
the graduating nurses, 1922.
Yes.
You know, so
Yes.
these were the girls who had
At the same
attended.
time as he was there. Isn't that just astounding? Yes.
So anyway, a long way of saying that I'm quite far on with this. It feels sort of fated, and I'm having fun with it.
Great. So we might see it next year, something like that.
I've got a sabbatical in 2015.
Right,
I'm going to
yeah,
finish it
finish
then.
for that,
Yeah.
that's
I think 2016 would be the earliest, really.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
we'll look forward to that very much. And we should also add, you have some details about North Atlantic Drift is going to be appearing on film, I believe.
An odd sort of turn again is that I got an email a few weeks ago from a woman called Susan Kemp, who has she's got quite a pedigree in TV and film. Used to produce the Jonathan Ross film review show in London in her early days. She's now left the BBC and is making a life as an independent filmmaker. But she'd read the book and thought that there was a lot of potential for doing something with it film-wise. She'd been looking at Margaret Tate's portrait of Hugh
Yes.
McDermott. So we arranged that I would go up to Shetland and take her around a few places, and she would shoot and I would read and we would talk a bit. The week before we were meant to go, my father died. So it was a very odd few days of filming.
Difficult. Yes.
But
you did it anyway.
well, I did something. I mean, it was from my point of view, I can't even remember because it was such a blur.
Difficult
But
time.
hopefully, I mean, it's got a bit of a charge to it
Yes.
because of that.
And they're poems of childhood, many of them.
Exactly,
As well,
and it's
so
very
fitting
weird.
tribute to. So
But
that
one-
will be on in Glasgow for people to see.
It's for the Glasgow Film Festival,
Yeah.
part of a day of kind of Shetland or Northern related things that she's curating. They'll be showing Grierson's Drifters and Michael Pohl's Edge of the World as part of this day, and then in the evening we'll have a kind of live cabaret with projections and people doing things.
Sounds wonderful. Well, Alan, thank you so very much for the interview this afternoon and for reading for us from your book of poetry. We look forward very much to your next novel and to the film of North Atlantic Drift. Both sound like riches in abundance. So many thanks indeed
Well,
for your time.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
It's been a great fun to come, and so nice to talk with someone who really has read your work
Well, it's
and
my
understands
pleasure.
it.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you
I
very
know
much.
you have a strong Shetland connection
Ah, well,
yourself.
I'm very fond. Yeah.
All right.
Thank
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.